Tae-woo was not a businessman who dabbled in crime. He was crime. The kind of man other men whispered about before they dared to speak his name aloud. For 20 years he had run the city without ever needing to raise his voice. Judges ruled his way, cops looked the other way, and rival families learned that a meeting with Tae-woo was just a polite word for total surrender. He did not conquer with guns. He conquered by being inevitable. His phone buzzed once on the balcony table. He did not look at it. He did not need to. 3 rings, then silence. That was the signal. Across the city, a port supervisor would cancel a shipment. A district prosecutor would lose a file. A rival captain would recall his men from the docks. All because Tae-woo had not answered. Power, for him, was not the gun on his hip. It was the silence that followed when he chose not to speak. After a long day of meetings held just to fulfill all righteousness, he stepped out onto his balcony. The night air was cool, scented with cherry blossom and wet soil. From here, he could see the whole estate, farmland stretching out, the riding trails curving into dark fields, everything ringed by heavy security and absolute silence. He leaned on the dark railing, a cigar burning slow between his fingers, a drink untouched in his other hand. His gaze drifted across the courtyard to the opposite building. Light spilled from an open window. A figure stood in the lit room across the estate. Her silhouette moved behind the frosted glass, the elegant line of her shoulder, the striking shape of her deep brown skin through the fabric, lit from behind like polished stone. Irene was unaware of the eyes on her. For a few minutes the light shifted. She stepped away, likely into the shower. Don stayed at the rail, his drink still untouched. When she returned, she was pulling her crisp uniform on, fastening the last button against her collar. Something made her pause. It was not curiosity, just habit, one last look out at the grounds before closing the curtain. That was when she saw him. Not a shadow, not a trick of the light. Tae-woo stood at the balcony rail opposite her building, eyes fixed on her window. He had not moved. He had not looked away. The air went perfectly still. Her breath caught in her throat. Her hand shot out and yanked the heavy curtain closed, plunging the room into blackness. He remembered the ancient king on the rooftop. "One look," he muttered, ash falling from his cigar, "is all it takes." When the curtain fell, his reflection stared back from the dark glass. He went inside, but the silence felt different now. The estate ran on strict, unyielding rules. New faces rotated in and out constantly, vetted harder than his own bodyguards, and kept isolated for exactly 7 days to prevent any leaks. Park Myung-ho, called Hound by the men, had built this flawless system. Ex-military, ex-loyalty, now Tae-woo's absolute right hand. Hound did not trust attachments of any kind. "No loose ends," he would always say, a motto carved from a lifetime of survival. Tae-woo had written that rule himself years ago, but Irene was not like the others who passed through these halls. Her presence was quiet, yet it shook the foundation of his routine. She brought him hot tea instead of coffee, without ever being asked, having noticed the slight tremor in his fingers after late-night negotiations. She read thick novels in the garden during her short breaks, her dark skin a beautiful contrast against the pale stone benches. She did not flinch or cast her eyes downward when he walked past. These were small things, but in Tae-woo's world, small things added up to a dangerous calculus. He began to alter his schedule, a subtle shift that did not escape Hound's watchful eyes. Tae-woo would linger in the study longer, waiting for the precise moment her footsteps echoed in the hallway. When she entered the room to clear the dishes, the silence between them was not the suffocating kind he used to command. It was alive, filled with an unspoken curiosity that kept him rooted to his chair. He watched the way her hands moved with deliberate grace, entirely devoid of the nervous franticness that plagued everyone else in his orbit. "You are far from home, Irene," he said one afternoon, his voice a low baritone that broke the quiet. She stopped, holding the silver tray tightly, her dark eyes meeting his without a hint of submission. "Home is wherever I am permitted to keep my thoughts to myself, Chairman," she replied softly. Her voice carried a calm weight that surprised him. Before he could respond, she bowed slightly and exited the room, leaving behind the faint scent of jasmine and a lingering warmth that Tae-woo could not easily shake. He found himself looking at the clock, counting the hours until her next shift. Hound watched him from the shadows of the doorway, his expression hardened by suspicion. "The girl is a distraction, boss," Hound warned later that evening. Tae-woo did not answer, his silence a dangerous shield. The intrigue deepened with the arrival of the monsoon rains, turning the estate into an isolated island of mud and stone. Tae-woo found himself increasingly restless, the predictable rhythms of his empire suddenly feeling like a gilded cage. He spent his evenings staring at the closed curtains of Irene's quarters, wondering what thoughts occupied her mind. One night, unable to sleep, he walked the grounds, his boots crunching softly on the wet gravel. He was drawn toward the stables, where the scent of hay and horses offered a brief escape from the suffocating politics of his family. As he pushed the heavy wooden door open, the sound of a low, rhythmic humming greeted him. Irene was there, kneeling in the straw, checking a stallion's rear hoof while the rest of the house slept. The only other sound was the heavy animals shifting quietly in their stalls. She did not startle when his shadow fell over her. She simply finished her inspection, patted the horse's flank, and stood up, brushing the stray straw from her apron. "He has a slight swelling," she said, nodding toward the horse, acting as if meeting the most feared man in the country at 3 a.m. was entirely ordinary. "The rain makes the ground treacherous." Tae-woo stepped closer, the warmth of the stable closing in around them. "You know horses," he remarked, observing the calm confidence in her posture. "My grandfather raised them in Louisiana," she said, a faint, nostalgic smile touching her lips. "They do not lie to you. If they do not trust you, you know immediately." They talked for an hour, not about the intricate workings of the estate, and certainly not about the blood that paid for it. They spoke of the rain, of how the vast fields smelled after a massive storm, and of places far beyond the city lines. For the first time in 20 years, Tae-woo was not calculating an advantage. When she turned to leave, a sudden panic seized him, a rare, human impulse. He reached out, his fingers brushing the fabric of her sleeve. Not to stop her by force, just to feel something undeniably real. Irene paused, looking down at his hand, then up into his eyes. She leaned back slightly, not out of fear, but with a firm, quiet boundary that asserted her own sovereignty. Tae-woo let go immediately, feeling a strange prickle of shame. "I apologize," he muttered. She nodded once, a gesture of understanding, and walked into the dark rain. Trust is a fragile currency in the underworld, usually bought with blood or guaranteed by fear. Yet over the next month, an unspoken trust began to solidify between the Korean Mafia Don and the quiet woman from across the ocean. Tae-woo found himself sharing pieces of his past he had buried deep beneath his fearsome reputation. He told her of his early days, the desperate hunger that drove him to seize power, and the crushing loneliness that came with holding it. Irene listened without judgment, her expressive eyes absorbing his confessions. In turn, she shared her own vulnerabilities, the struggle of adapting to a culture that viewed her as a permanent outsider, and the fierce independence that kept her moving forward. This growing connection did not go unnoticed. The atmosphere within the estate grew noticeably tense. The guards whispered in the corridors, and Hound's gaze turned freezing cold whenever Irene entered a room. The power dynamic on the estate was shifting subtly. The staff realized that access to the Dawn now went through a quiet woman who held no official rank. One evening, Tae-woo summoned Hound to his private study. The air was thick with tension. "I am extending Irene's contract," Tae-woo announced, not looking up from his ledger. 3 months instead of the standard 7 days. Update the security clearance. Hound stepped forward, his fists clenching at his sides. "This violates every protocol we established, boss. The family is already talking. Your uncle is looking for any sign of weakness. Keeping an outsider here for this long is a security liability we cannot afford." Tae-woo raised his eyes, a cold, dead gaze that had broken stronger men than Hound. "The protocol changes because I say it changes, Myung-ho. Do your job." Hound held his gaze for a long, agonizing moment before bowing stiffly and exiting. Tae-woo knew he was playing a dangerous game. By breaking his own rules for Irene, he was exposing his flank to his enemies. His uncle, who controlled 40% of the family business, was a vulture waiting for the old lion to stumble. Yet, looking out at the darkened courtyard, Tae-woo realized the stakes had changed. He was no longer just protecting an empire. He was protecting a fragile sanctuary he had found in the most unlikely person. The psychological stakes reached a boiling point as the final days of Irene's original contract approached. Tae-woo's obsession with her safety and presence had become a tangible force within the mansion. He no longer cared about the whispers of his captains or the growing dissent among his uncle's faction. His entire world had narrowed down to the quiet moments he shared with her. He wanted to tell her about the contract extension himself, to see their relief, or perhaps the joy in her eyes, to know that she wanted to stay by his side. He walked down the long, dimly lit corridor toward her quarters in the servants' wing, a place he had never visited before. The silence in this part of the house was heavy, almost suffocating. As he reached her door, he noticed it was slightly ajar, a sliver of yellow light cutting through the darkness of the hallway. That was wrong. The estate rules dictated all doors be locked after midnight. He pushed the door open quietly, his hand instinctively reaching for the firearm concealed inside his jacket. The room was quiet in the entirely wrong way. The scent of copper and fresh blood hit his nose instantly. On the floor lay Hound, his massive frame crumpled awkwardly. A single, precise gunshot wound to the center of his chest. The white carpet beneath him was stained a brilliant, horrific crimson. The gun on the nightstand belonged to Hound himself. Irene stood frozen against the far wall, her face pale, her hands trembling violently. There was a smear of dark blood on her sleeve, the unmistakable result of a desperate, failed attempt to help the dying man. She looked up as Tae-woo entered, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and confusion. I heard a noise. Before Tae-woo could speak, the heavy, rhythmic thud of combat boots echoed down the hallway. The estate guards were coming, alerted by the silent alarm Hound must have triggered before he died. The trap was springing perfectly. Tae-woo had only seconds to react. He knew how this looked, how his uncle would use this to destroy them both. He stepped into the room, his mind racing through a dozen lethal scenarios. The heavy footsteps grew louder, a relentless countdown in the narrow hallway. Tae-woo moved with the terrifying efficiency that had kept him alive for 2 decades. He did not ask Irene for explanations. There was no time for truth. He pulled a silk handkerchief from his pocket, wiped his own fingerprints from Hound's service weapon, and carefully placed the cold metal into the dead man's stiffening hand, angling it to look like a desperate suicide or a tragic accident during a struggle. He grabbed Irene's arm, his grip firm but remarkably gentle, and pulled her behind him into the deep shadow of the walk-in closet, just as the door burst open. 3 armed guards rushed in, weapons raised, their eyes widening at the sight of their fallen commander.
"Call the medical team! Secure the perimeter!"
one shouted into his radio. In the darkness of the closet, Tae-woo could feel Irene's heart hammering against his chest like a trapped bird. Her breath was shallow, hot against his neck. He pressed a finger to her lips, his eyes locking onto hers, demanding absolute silence. The guards quickly searched the main room, completely missing the hidden compartment in their panic. Once they rushed out to secure the hallway, Tae-woo led Irene through a service exit that led directly to his private quarters. Now, the evidence pointed squarely at her. The motive his enemies would construct was completely flawless. A foreign worker, held past her contract against her will, retaliating against the brutal head of security. Tae-woo sat at his desk, the cigar gone entirely cold in his hand, staring at Irene as she sat shivering in a chair. The illusion of his absolute control had vanished. His uncle would use this incident to call an emergency meeting of the council, demanding Irene's execution and Tae-woo's stepping down for incompetence. And somewhere deep within the estate, the actual killer, the shadow who had pulled the trigger to frame her, was watching intently to see what the Dawn would do next. For the first time since he had stood on that balcony, Han Tae-woo was completely unsure of his next move. The empire he built was fracturing, and the catalyst was the woman whose hand he still held. The morning sun brought no warmth, only the grim reality of a gathering storm. The estate was locked down, surrounded by men loyal to Tae-woo's uncle, Chairman Park. The emergency council meeting was set for noon in the main dining hall. Irene remained hidden in Tae-woo's private vault, a room reinforced with steel and accessible only by his biometric scan. He stood before her one last time before facing the wolves. "They will demand your life, Irene," he said, his voice devoid of emotion, a mask he wore for the world. "It is the law of the family. Blood for blood." Irene looked up, her fear replaced by a cold, sharp clarity. "And what does your law say about the truth, Tae-woo? Hound didn't come to my room to protect you. He came to kill me, because I found this." She reached into her pocket and produced a small, encrypted flash drive. He forgot it in the stables. It contains the bank routing numbers. Hound wasn't loyal. He was selling your shipping routes to your uncle for months. The revelation hit Tae-woo with the force of a physical blow. The betrayal by his right hand was bitter, but the realization of Irene's intelligence and bravery was intoxicating. She had not panicked. She had investigated. She was not the victim of the trap. She was the key to dismantling it. Tae-woo took the drive, his mind instantly reshaping the upcoming confrontation. He entered the dining hall, where his uncle and the senior captains sat waiting, their faces grim with anticipated triumph. Chairman Park slammed his hand on the table. "The foreigner must hang, Tae-woo. She murdered our finest soldier. You have grown weak, blinded by a distraction. Step down before we force you." The captains murmured in agreement, their loyalty wavering in the wind of a new power dynamic. Tae-woo stood at the head of the table, entirely silent. He let the tension build until the room was suffocatingly quiet. Then, he tossed the flash drive onto the polished mahogany table. It slid to a halt right in front of his uncle. "Let us talk about loyalty," Tae-woo said softly, his voice a promise of death. The digital evidence displayed on the wall monitor was irrefutable. Document by document, the secret alliance between Chairman Park and the deceased Hound was laid bare before the council. The captains watched in stunned silence as the financial transactions and leaked coordinates proved that the man they thought was a martyr was actually a traitor, and the uncle who claimed to protect the family was the one tearing it apart. Chairman Park's face drained of color, his hands shaking as he realized the trap had snapped shut on his own neck.
This is a fabrication,"
he sputtered, looking around the room for support, but finding only the cold, hard stares of men who smelled blood. Tae-woo did not raise his voice. He simply signaled his personal loyalists. "Take my uncle to the lower cellar," he ordered smoothly. "He will sign over his 40% share by sunset. Afterward, ensure he leaves the country. Permanently." The room cleared quickly, the captains eager to distance themselves from the failed coup. An hour later, Tae-woo returned to his private quarters and opened the vault. Irene stepped out, looking at him with an inscrutable expression. "It is over," he said, stepping closer to her. "You are safe. The estate is yours to stay in, for as long as you desire. I can give you everything now: protection, wealth, a position at my side." Irene looked at the powerful man before her, recognizing the deep obsession in his eyes. He had broken his own empire to save her, but in doing so, he had revealed his ultimate weakness. She possessed a strange power over the most dangerous man in the city. She walked past him to the large glass window, looking out at the sprawling grounds. "You built an empire on silence, Tae-woo," she said softly, turning to face him. "But a cage of gold is still a cage. I will stay, but not as your subordinate, not as your secret." Tae-woo felt a complex wave of emotion, a mix of defeat and profound thrill. The power dynamic had shifted completely. He had saved her life, but she had captured his soul. As he stood beside her, looking out at the vast estate, the silence returned, but it was no longer his alone to command.